Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Training Magazine Network webinar event, How to Develop Leaders That People Actually Want to Work For, with Susan Clarine. She's the founder and CEO of the EI Coach. We're very glad to have Susan with us here today for this very special topic, and we're also thankful to MHS Assessments for making today's event possible. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Philip Rodriguez, today's webinar producer. And don't forget, you can subscribe for free to Training Magazine. You can get complimentary digital or print or both simply by going to trainingmagnetwork.com/subscribe. And here's today's Insights widget. If you log into trainingmagnetwork.com, log in first, then click on the link on your screen. That's also available over in the notes space. You can put in your thoughts about today's webinar. What are your takeaways? What are you going to apply right away? And you can even see other people's insights. We have even people use this kind of to add notes to and share them with their peers and colleagues in Training Magazine Network. Once you do submit your insights, you can print out a certificate for attending today's event. So make sure you check out the Insights widget and use that tool. And the Innovations in Training Special Conference in Dublin, Ireland is coming up. For more information on this event, special event in November, go to www.innovationsin.training. I know it's a little different looking of a URL, but that is the correct URL, and I'll actually put that in the note space here a little bit later in the session so everyone can check out the new Innovations in Training World Conference in Dublin. And speaking of new, there's also the Choice Awards. You can cast your vote today and get your chance to win one of two different Maui Jim sunglasses just by answering the questions. We want to hear from you, so join hundreds of your training and learning peers by voting today in the all-new Training Magazine Choice Awards. It only takes a minute or two, so click on your screen, and it's also available, the link in the note space, and answer today's Training Magazine Network Choice Awards. Here's some more community events coming up, so check your webinar times. We have two events tomorrow, and then on September 24th, Dr. Alan Partridge returns with repurposing and upgrading your legacy content for today's e-learning courses. Where do you find all this great information? Why, at trainingmagnetwork.com. Over on the right-hand side, you'll find the calendar of free webinars, the recorded webinar archive, where we have over 1,000 webinars available to you. Over 1,000, think about that. 24/7 access to over 1,000 free webinars, and the free white paper, ebooks, resources, and the like, all available to you for being members in Training Magazine Network. And we'll want to thank again MHS Assessments for making today's event possible. And we're going to hear more about them here in just a few moments. So let's get today's event started. How to develop leaders that people actually want to work for with Susan Clarine. I'm going to introduce Jason Rackett with MHS Assessments. And Jason, welcome to today's session.
Hi, Philip. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone on the line for joining us today. For those that are new on the line, new to MHS, a little bit about us and who we are. Multi-Health Systems is a global publisher of scientifically validated assessments in the clinical, education, public safety, and talent assessment markets. And MHS is headquartered in Toronto, Canada, and we have been in business for over 30 years now. In the talent assessment space, we are most widely known for our work in emotional intelligence, and specifically the EQI 2.0, which Susan will be talking about here in a couple minutes. And in addition to emotional intelligence, we do have a diverse toolkit, including assessments and simulations that focus on key leadership skills such as resilience, change, influence, and decision making. Now, in addition to having industry-leading research and assessments, MHS has a global network of coaches, trainers, and facilitators that use these validated tools to solve their clients' challenges. And so it's my privilege to introduce to you Susan Clarine, as we've heard today from Philip as well. And again, Susan is the founder and CEO of the EI Coach and is committed to helping managers and teams gain insight into how their emotions affect their work, relationships, as well as their results. Now, with nearly 20 years experience in organizational development and talent management and coaching, Susan brings a collaborative and creative spirit to all of her client relationships. Susan engages with her clients on all kinds of interesting people challenges, and most notably works with her clients to focus on team performance and communication styles, as well as how to use productive conflict to keep driving profits. When not focusing on the team level, Susan is working with individuals to create more self-awareness and development, or teaching leaders how to influence others and to move towards a common goal. Now, obviously, Susan has a lot of great knowledge and experience to share with the group, so let me transition you now to the EI coach. Susan, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Philip and Training Magazine. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about my favorite subject, which is emotional intelligence, and share with you one of my favorite coaching tools, which is the EQ 360. So, spoiler alert, one of the best ways to develop people into leaders that other people actually want to work for is to really tap into that leader's true inner goals, desires, aspirations, and most importantly, what's meaningful for them. And so taking an emotional intelligence approach and using the EQ 360, it's a very powerful combination for coaching, for shifting leaders' mindsets. And those are the first two things I'm going to start with today, and then also touch upon how can you incorporate the EQ 360 and some other great EQ tools into your organization, or if you're an external coach and consultant, what that could look like for you. And I'd like to begin by introducing all of you to Sean. Not his real name, but Sean is a leader that I worked with, and Sean's story is that he'd been in the home office, and when I started working with him, had been promoted into a role as a regional sales manager. And he's someone who was certainly a high potential. He described himself as being the fix-it guy. He was really known for being the turnaround leader to really help struggling teams. And this particular team was struggling. And he also described himself as being a Gen X leader. So what that meant for him is he saw himself who was very results-oriented, task-driven, and he was really struggling when it came to managing some boomers on his team that he felt were resistant to change, as well as millennials on his team that Sean's perception was wanted all of this feedback, and connection, and he was somebody who kept saying, you know, I don't want to go for a beer after work. I don't want to have to be their best friend. I just want to set them on the path, give them their goals, and let them go. And then he also had a team that was dispersed as well as local. And also importantly was to know that as he was relocated, you know, he was married with 2 kids. His 8-year-old was doing great, loved the new school system. His 14-year-old was not a happy camper. And it's important when we talk about emotional intelligence to really look at the whole person, because what happens to us at work impacts our home life, and the stressors and demands of home impact work, and vice versa. So even before we did the EQ 360 together, Sean and I, we knew going into it there were a few key areas that we'd want to take a look at, which was his self-perception, his communication and relationship skills, and then also how he was making people decisions. And I'm curious, and we're going to show a poll here in a minute, based upon all your experience in the organizations you're in or the organizations you're coaching, which emotional intelligence skills do you think that your leaders need to develop the most? And Phil's going to show a poll here. So hopefully everyone can see that, and you can select the poll answers. Oh, great, I see it coming in, right? So the areas are self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal skills, making decision-solving problems, and coping with stress and change. So I'll leave that up there for just a moment.
I see people answering. Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
And Susie, you want to go ahead and look at the results?
Yep.
Great.
I do, and I put view votes. No, can everyone see that? The results?
They can.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Phil. So, okay, great. Interestingly, the majority, as you can all see, is interpersonal skills. And that's great because when you think about helping leaders to develop their own EQ skills and EQ skill set that people want to work for, certainly the foundation is interpersonal skills, and all of the rest really supports that. So let's start with our first section, which is what is the EQ 360 and why is it such a powerful model? And we'll look briefly at what is emotional intelligence, just so we're all kind of talking from the same definition, and why it matters so much at work. And this definition is one I love. I borrowed it from Dr. Stephen Stein, who wrote The EQ Leader. And essentially, emotional intelligence, really, it's just about identifying and managing emotional information in ourselves and others. And then the last bullet point of the definition here, I really like because my leaders really like it, which is it's all about the ability to focus our emotional energy on the right required behaviors to get things done. So I encourage all of you to share this definition too with your leaders, because when you really present it as, this is emotional and social skills that can be learned, that influence our people decisions, how we cope with change, but ultimately it's all about using emotional information in an effective and meaningful way for you, for the organization, and the team. And it's all about having emotions work for us rather than against us. And approaching it with that definition really resonates with leaders. And so how does it work? So I use a lot of different assessments, and the EQ 360 is one of my very favorites, and I will share why with you. So how does all of this work? Essentially, the model for the 360 is bucketed into these 5 key composite areas, starting with self-perception. That's really the foundation. So when you all said, interpersonal skills is really what you're seeing leaders struggle with the most, you have to start back with how are they understanding and seeing themselves, their own emotions and triggers, what are their goals, motivations, and aspirations, so you can help the leader bridge that gap between their self-perception and others' perception. Self-expression then is about openly expressing their emotions, their opinions. How do leaders disagree? How do they disagree respectfully? How do they dissent, deal with conflict? What are their verbal and nonverbal communication skills, and are they self-directed? And then the interpersonal component is exactly what you might think. It's about our interpersonal skills, but this particular realm and area of EQ is all about establishing trust. You have to have that foundation of trust to build inclusivity and engagement. And then we move into the decision-making composite. And this sometimes surprises leaders because they don't really think of decision-making in emotional terms. But underneath, in the subconscious, we're all driven by emotional reactions, memories, responses, and biases that impact how we make decisions, how we embrace risk, and also tapping into our creativity. And then lastly is the stress management component, which is all about building resilience for the leader and the team. And this is really important when it comes to change management. And ultimately, it's about consciously using the right emotion at the right time to get things done. And I like to think of this, it looks like a compass, but what makes it such an effective coaching tool is that, to me, it's like an onion. So you can start at a very high level, 50,000 foot view with your leader, and then you can start to peel the onion and look in deeper into, well, what's really motivating them and motivating those perceptions. And that's where you can get into then the 15 subscales that support each of these 5 composite areas. And then what's also unique about the 360 is the leader will get feedback and a score on their sense of happiness and well-being that we know is very important to leadership and management. And if you want to see this in detail, then I encourage you to download the attachments, which will show you in detail what this model looks like. So why is this important? Well, we know for leadership success, it's basically an equation of these 3 things. So leaders have to be good at the job. So we could call that TQ. Are they competent in their technical and their job skills. And then we all have a certain amount of IQ, right? Our emotional or intellectual intelligence capacity. And so basically people are going to be somewhere between average to above average intelligence. But what really sets leaders and success apart is this emotional and social skill component. And it's becoming more and more important, on the job to have the EQ component as well. And so here's a few statistics to share around why this is so important. And what I'd like to call out for you is emotional intelligence equates to about 45 to 58% of job performance for average performers. But when we really look at, well, what makes leaders very successful and what makes our star performers, it's all the emotional intelligence skills. And then we also know that people with an average IQ but high EQ can outperform those with the highest IQ about 70% of the time. And then we also know it's important for teams. So research has shown that teams with higher EQ can outperform those with low EQ. And it's also important for organizations as well. In fact, there's a really great report that HBR came out with in their analytics group. They partnered with the Four Seasons, and they looked at companies who reported out high EQ cultures versus low EQ cultures. And those with higher EQ cultures, you can see they had higher productivity, employee engagement, which is a big focus for organizations, innovation, profitability. They had higher customer advocacy and higher customer loyalty. So we know it's important at an individual, team, and an organizational level. So how do we recognize emotional intelligence in our leaders and in ourselves? So as you see here on the slide, this is not a complete list, but it is some characteristics of low emotional intelligence. You might even recognize yourself up here. I know I certainly do. And we all have these low EQ moments. And the reason that happens is emotional intelligence is a mindset. It's also a neurological response. So you see that picture there over to the right of your screen where the brain looks like an iceberg. So you can think of our conscious awareness like that iceberg. And as we go throughout the day, we use about 10% of our conscious awareness. The rest, the 90% that's beneath the surface, that's the emotional habits, the mental patterns, the biases, and the judgments that tend to drive our low emotional intelligence responses. And all this is happening in a very unconscious way. And we say it's egocentric because it's coming from a place of self-protection. So what that might look like at work is when we are trying to force our own agenda, when we're being confrontational, when we feel provoked, when we're making judgments. That's how it shows up. And we say it takes energy because as this is happening, we're also having stress hormones that are coursing through our system, for example, cortisol. So it can be very exhausting for people and for leaders. Conversely, when we look at high emotional intelligence, and again, you might recognize yourself here, this is really about making the unconscious conscious. So people who are really good at emotional intelligence, they start to develop that awareness of emotions and reactions and responses that are working for them or against them. So it's about making it conscious and it's about making it value-centric. And when we do this, then we're actually creating energy. And we know that it releases oxytocin and serotonin, which is good for bonding relationships and which is really good, for developing engagement with our employees. We also know this is really important because what comes to us from Center for Creative Leadership, when they looked at, well, what are the top reasons leaders derail? It's all emotional intelligence, right? So it's not being flexible and adapting to change. It's not being able to work well on a team, and it's poor interpersonal relationships. And then Center for Creative Leadership, CCL, did another study to take a look at, well, what are the emotional intelligence skills that really set apart the most successful leaders? And that top red line there are the 15 emotional intelligence competencies that the EQ 360 measures. And then you can see that in comparison to the average and unsuccessful leaders. And what's fascinating, and this is a great graphic to share with your leaders as well in this study, is because it's not problem solving or reality testing or even assertiveness at the top. It's stress tolerance. It's optimism and happiness. That's what makes for the most successful leaders. And this really comes from a phenomenon called social contagion. And we know that a leader's emotional state impacts the team. A team member's emotional state impacts the rest of the team. And if you wanted to do more reading on this, I also recommend Primal Leadership by Daniel Goleman, where he really talks about how the leader's emotional state can impact the team. So with that foundation, let's go back and take a look at good old Sean here. So I've pulled out a few key pieces of the EQ 360 so you can see what it looks like in a real coaching situation. And again, you've got the detailed report as a downloadable attachment in this presentation. So first of all, the EQ 360 reports out the self-assessment. So here we see how Sean sees himself. And very quickly, it gives the leader a benchmark. So we can see Sean's total emotional intelligence score is 91. And then we can see that compared to his executive summary. So on that executive summary, we can very quickly see, and Sean can very quickly see, what are the highest areas and then what are the lowest areas, as well as it gives you a report out of leadership derailers. So again, I really like this report because it gives the leader a really quick snapshot and place to start, that outer part of the onion. And what was important for Sean was leveraging his strengths of self-actualization and problem solving, because he was all about purpose in his own life and work, and purpose and sense of meaning for his team. He wanted that. He wanted to be a great coach, and he really wanted to solve this problem that he was stuck with not being able to effectively coach and turn around this team. So starting with what was important and meaningful to him and leveraging that as a way to look at, well, how could he then shore up the interpersonal skills, the empathy? That was really helpful, because remember, he was a guy that kept saying, you know, I don't want to go for the beer. So we had to start looking at, well, how could he shift his mindset and shift it in a way that was meaningful and important to him? So that's what we'll take a look at next. So we'll take a look at how do you coach with the 360, some different strategies, and then I'll also share with you an example of how I use this with a leader who was derailing to get that leader back on track. So why is the EQ 360 so helpful? Well, you know, when you think about your leaders, you think about your managers, they're problem solvers, right? So especially when they're putting out fires and priorities are constantly shifting, they can be very transactional, and we want to get them to a place that's transitional, right? But they're very focused on solving the problem, getting things right, getting things done. And when a leader is successful at that, neurologically, they're getting a dopamine hit. And dopamine comes from the reward system in the brain. And it feels good. It feels good to them, but what they don't recognize is the impact they're having on others. So when we approach emotional intelligence, it's really taking that brain-based approach. And the brain is amazing and wonderful because the brain can form new patterns as you learn these skills. And what the EQ 360 does then is it helps the leader drill down into not only their self-awareness, but why am I thinking and believing and having those judgments and perceptions? Why is that? What's underneath that? And is it working for me or not working for me? And that really helps the leader to gain buy-in. It helps to develop different practices then that can sustain the leader and really start to shift in a very fundamental and internal way based upon their innate sense of what's meaningful for them and what drives them to change, to start to shift that. And ultimately, we know neuroplasticity is really the only way to change behavior. It's really about forming new connections and new synapses between the neurons. And that's when you start to get long-term, sustained change at a behavioral level, because the leader themselves has changed fundamentally at a thought pattern level, at a mindset, at a neurological level. So what this looked like for Sean is here you can see what his self-report looks like at a detailed level. And then what I always like to do is just to take a line right down the midpoint of 100, and very quickly, again, the leader can get a visual impression of where am I strong, where am I over 100 and where am I under 100, and what does that mean for me? And so for Sean, again, just in his case, what that meant was really tapping into his sense of purpose under that self-actualization component and realm, and also his problem-solving nature. And then that was the avenue in for shoring up and developing his emotional expression and empathy. And one of the first things then he did was he brought the team together and did team visioning. And that's something that they hadn't done before. So developing their team vision, their shared values as a team to help level set. The EQ 360 report also gives open comments. And so I won't be sharing his open comments, but from the open comments, we also knew that people just didn't feel like they knew him, even after a year. So it was him being more emotionally expressive, sharing his thoughts, opinions, and then also how he was communicating with his team and taking a more empathic approach. And that worked for him because it tied into what was meaningful and important for Sean. And then another really great area of this report for leaders is it buckets the different 15 competencies into these high-level areas that we know when it comes to developing leaders that people want to work for. It's these 4 things. It's, are they an authentic leader? Are they great at coaching? Are they good at developing insight and innovation? And then for Sean, in his case, green check mark, you can see where we focused on the self-actualization and by expressing that more through his emotional expression. So Sean was able to go from a tell-sell kind of communication style to one that was listening and then coaching, and his mantra became, okay, I want to solve for the person first before I jump to the problem. Building trust is the way ultimately to solve the problem. Going slow to go fast with people, that's the way to actually achieve results. And then as you go deeper into the report, here is a visual of then Sean's self-score against all his other raters. And again, it's a nice clean visual that leaders can see very quickly. And as they look at this, you can see that the blind spots are on the left and the strength areas are on the right. And as we look at how Sean reported out, the lower left corner of the quadrant is where Sean might have rated himself lower than the rest of his raters. So those are some untapped strengths. In the upper left corner, that's where he rated himself higher than other folks did and other raters. So that was something to take a look at, specifically around the self-actualization component. And then on the right, we had the light strengths and the reinforced opportunities. And Sean didn't have that, but I'll show you another example of a leader who did. But again, it's a nice, easy, quick visual. And then when you need and want to go into the detail, then the leader can see, well, how did everyone report out across all rater groups? And then what I also really like about this particular report that can be really helpful for coaching is that it also has a category for friends and family. And that can generate some real interesting aha light bulb moments for the leader because they can see, does friends and family have the same perception, a different perception? Why is that? Why am I different at home than I am at work? Or is everyone seeing me the same? So that creates a lot of light bulb moments and is also reinforced then in the comment section. So that brings us to Terry, just so you can see a different view of what this 360 looks like. And Terry was a leader who had also been relocated, a solid potential, and he's someone that the organization saw as a future leader. And he was doing great in terms of meeting operational goals, But where he was really derailing is that he disagreed with all the organizational changes, with the executive strategy, and he was having interpersonal conflicts with senior staff. And also, Terry had 2 teenagers, one who was adapting really well to the move, and then a 17-year-old son who was really struggling. And for Terry, what was meaningful and important to him was really utilizing this skill set, both in how he was talking to his son and then how he was interacting at work. And that provides just another avenue for helping to shift people's mindsets. And then here you can see for Terry, the executive summary, what that looked like in terms of high and low subscales. And then here you can see an example too of the quadrant where everyone's reporting out, and he can do that comparison. And very quickly, we can see, just looking at this and just scanning the bars, that he was rating himself very low when it came to emotional expression. And I have here the call out that with EQ, high may not be high and low may not be low, because Terry was actually a very self-aware person. But for him, the reason for behind the conflict was for him all around integrity and being honest and saying what was on his mind. And what he needed to work on was how he did that for greater influence and organizational impact. But because he'd been getting this feedback, he rated himself really, really low. And as a result, when we started the coaching relationship, he was in a place of very low self-confidence. So before we could even get to the other things, that's where we needed to start. We needed to start with what was impacting this confidence, this feedback he was getting, and starting to build up, again, what was meaningful for him. And what was meaningful for him was his team and making an impact in the organization. And then here, just so you can see that this is also in the report, again, it's these 4 big key areas of authenticity, coaching, insight, and innovation. And then you can also see this at a rater level and what that looks like. And that gives you, again, a nice place to start with the leader and recognize what's going to make the biggest impact for them. And when we think in terms of emotional intelligence, another important thing when it comes to shifting mindset is building resiliency and stress management. And this report is fantastic because it buckets these 4 areas that you see around self-awareness and flexibility and stress tolerance and optimism so that the leader can see that. And we know stress is very important to manage because when our leaders are under stress, then their ability to focus diminishes, neurological pathways are decreased. So even just from a brain perspective, it's really hard to open the mind and open up to new ways of thinking and leading when we're under stress. And so here's an example of what that could look like with a leader, Sheila, not her real name, who was a VP of HR for a company that was going through a lot of change, new leadership, new CEO. She'd been with the company about 20 years and had taken other 360s. So here's an example of how, we use this self-report to complement other 360s that she'd taken within the organization. And the reason she wanted to do this is because she was feeling stuck and she wasn't sure what was next. So she was going through all this transition at work. She was going through transition personally at home. And when she did the self-report, what really surprised her was how she reported out around stress and problem solving and optimism. So for Sheila, that's where we started. And we started with helping her do some visioning and visioning exercises around what did she want next? Were her values aligned with where she was now and where the organization was going? And because that's what was innately meaningful and important to her, that then opened her up to developing some of these other areas, especially in the interpersonal composite, where she was rating a little bit lower. So next, let's take a look at then, well, how can you incorporate some of these EQ tools into your organization, or if you're a coach in a coaching practice, what can that look like? And I'll also share with you another report, a group report, that can also be really helpful. So one recommendation, and this is just my advice based upon all the organizations I've worked with and what can make for successful implementation. And so I say, let your EQ efforts snowball. And what I mean by that is to start small. Start with a pilot group as an example. And I'm sure everyone who's attending today has probably had that experience of being in an organization where it feels like flavor of the month, right? So to say, okay, in 2020, we're going to send the whole marketing department through emotional intelligence skills because this is really important. That can actually backfire. So you want to make sure that first, your leadership, the executive leadership, is really talking about and having a dialogue with the employee group around why self-awareness, why self-perception, why getting along with the team, bias, conflict management, why this is so important. They don't even have to call it emotional intelligence, but they can just really talk about, how we manage ourselves, how we manage others, how we relate is very important and critical to us in the organization and where we're going. So it's important that some groundwork is laid. It's also important to approach emotional intelligence from an aspirational, a goal-oriented point of view, because we don't want to create more stress for employees who might be experiencing this or for the leader who might be getting coaching. So it's really important to connect the leader or the team to their true desire to change and what's behind that, because then the leader will be able to shift and release the emotional, the hormonal, and the neurological responses and pathways that are so important for them to ultimately begin to think and do things differently. And so the EQ can work very well either as a standalone or as a complement to other assessments. The important thing is to lay the groundwork, and the important thing too is also to give really good coaching and support behind it, because if you don't, for example, and I've had this happen, maybe if a leader gets a really low score, that can be very devastating, because unlike a personality assessment or unlike an assessment that talks about business acumen or strategic planning, people's perception is that this is really speaking to who they are as a human and to their character. And we need to educate them. We need to educate them to say, hey, we're human. We all have emotions. This is just how your emotions are driving your thought patterns. And this is something you can actually learn and change. If they don't get that coaching support, if they don't get that education behind it, it can actually have the opposite effect. So it's very effective then to make emotionally intelligent conversations part of the dialogue and part of everything you're doing at all of the people integration points in your organization. So here's a list of examples. You don't have to do all of these, but these are ways that I've used EQ, the assessments, and emotional intelligence very effectively in organizations. And I love it for onboarding and new leader integration. And so what that could look like is perhaps within the first 3 months of a new leader joining an organization, they do the self-assessment. And then at a year or so, they do the 360, and they're getting that feedback. And then the leader and the team have this nice benchmark for how the leader's doing. There's a great group report, a team report, which I'll show you in just a moment, which is also really effective with new leader integration. So you could combine the self-report with the team's group report. Again, and with that idea of snowballing, it's also a great tool to introduce to your leadership development or high potential programs that also helps build credibility and good stories around the assessment, because people do love this, right? So they love learning about themselves and they love working on these skills. And especially when your high potential leaders get this as part of their leadership development programs, then it becomes seen as something very special. And so that also helps build the credibility behind it and starts to help build success stories. Another great way to use it is with your talent management and succession planning strategies. And so, it's certainly common that maybe you have a general manager who certainly needs the business skills side, needs to go lead a new function, or maybe they're national, they need to go lead international. But those of us who've been in those conversations know there's also these skills around how they communicate, how they influence, how they build relationships. And so the model of the EQ model and the EQ 360, especially with those 5 main areas of self-awareness and self-expression, interpersonal skills, decision-making, and stress, align so nicely with any kind of leadership model that might be out there, and align so nicely with the organizational values, however you want to approach that. And MHS offers this great group report that I'll show you where you can really get a look at that. It's also great to think about emotional intelligence as part of your engagement strategies. Sometimes managers can feel stuck sometimes when they get this engagement feedback back and they don't know where to go with that. And the EQ reports give them something very tangible that they can then work on with their team. So great, making it meaningful and getting that buy-in from the leader. It can also be really helpful when it comes to leadership strategic planning and offsites. So let me show you an example here of what the group report looks like. And so this is an example that I used with a group of about 70 leaders nationally across an organization, and they were doing their annual planning and setting their strategy and direction. And they did that part first, and then we spent a good half day on emotional intelligence and looking at it broadly across all 70 leaders. And again, it's a nice, simple, quick, fast snapshot that leaders can take and say, oh, okay, as a whole leadership group, and this was director level and above, here's where we're strong, here's where we're less strong. Well, what does all of this mean, and which are the most important components we should focus on when it comes to our strategy going forward? And then if you're working in a talent management realm or succession planning realm, this is group reports great for that, because then you can assess a whole cohort and see how they're doing. And then you can work on creating the development programs and strategies and experiences that help to continue to build their strengths and shore up any areas that need improvement. And then so you can see it, this is what this particular group looked like. And similar as I do with one-on-one coaching, to show them, okay, here's the midpoint, here's where you're a little higher, here's where you're a little lower. This particular group was all right around the midpoint. And, the question they asked is that good? Is that bad, right? And it's really team-specific and context-specific. It's, well, what does this mean to you? And they could very quickly see, all right, we're strong at decision-making and stress management. Oh, we're a little lower when it comes to assertiveness and emotional expression. Well, what does that mean for us collectively as a leadership team? And so they were able to break out in some groups, some teams, and do some work around that based upon how all of this aligned directionally with what their priorities were for the next year. And then also within this report, it's really nice because it shows you for each of the sub-skills the distribution across a particular group. And again, very unique to this assessment, but so important, is that happiness index. And again, the research tells us, and we know, happiness has a huge impact on employee engagement. So no good or bad, right or wrong, right? But this is how they reported out. And then they had some really interesting conversations around, okay, well, what does this mean? How do we make some adjustments? What do we need to do as a leadership team? And then what do we need to do in terms of how we're communicating and dealing in a functional and department level with our particular teams and groups? And you get this for each one of the different 15 sub-skills. This is also really great for engagement. So as you're getting your engagement reports and you're seeing the different areas where employees are giving feedback, this group report is great for looking at, okay, well, how can this inform our strategy going forward? And to generate the group report, you would decide what the group is, the cohort, the team, and then everyone would take a self-assessment. And then it all can roll up into a group report. And that self-assessment can either be a standalone self-assessment or 360. And then last area to mention is using the group report for teams And some of you might be familiar with the Project Aristotle that Google did in 2016, where they really looked at what equates team success. And they spent a year looking at different kinds of teams, formal and informal, extroverted teams, introverted teams, and what they really came down to was what set apart teams that had the best performance and the most success were teams where team members got to all talk and share about an equal amount of time. So whether there was a formal team leader or not, everyone got to talk and share. And then the second component was that teams had what they called high social sensitivity, which meant it was a psychologically safe place. And that really gets into the social intelligence component and interpersonal skills. So ultimately, it all came down to EQ. Right? It all came down to these things to really help the teams then really be more innovative, creative, to have healthy conflict debate, and be productive. And so that group report, it's a great feedback mechanism for the team then to look at where are they doing well, maybe what are some areas where they also want to improve. And then lastly, I should mention before we move on that I was sharing with you the Leadership EQ 360. MHS is terrific because they also, you can do this just for an individual contributor if you want. So it doesn't have to be just at the leadership level. And their tools, they call them workplace reports, workforce reports, or the leadership reports. It can really span all levels of leaders and individual contributors as well as groups. So it's really nice that once you introduce one of these solutions, then you have other tools and mechanisms to make it sustainable for the organization and the team. So with that, and before we go on, I do want to do a check-in because I shared a whole lot with you today, and I'm going to check in with Jason to see if there's some key questions and comments that have come up that that either Jason or I would like to address.
Yeah, sure, Susan. Great job talking through all that. I know it's a lot of information, and like you said, to share with everyone. So good thing to check in. I would say there's been a number of questions that have come in. One thing we maybe want to address in a couple different ways. There was a lot of questions on the quadrant section. We always say, you get those a lot, I get those a lot. It's understandably, that's a tough page to kind of read through at a quick glance. So we had a lot of questions there on how to interpret that. And then also on the mapping, there were some questions on authenticity, coaching, insight, and innovation. So I would say two things quickly to respond to that. And then Susan, I'll let you finish up the response on that. The quadrant page, remember, that's where the participant is being compared to all raters, regardless of their rater group. The next page after that we didn't see has a comparison to specific rater groups. So that's one of the differences on those pages. It's why you're seeing a lot of data points there. But it can be a little confusing at first. But I think with some additional explanation, either Susan and I could do offline. If it was really more of a challenge, we'd be happy with you to go through that. And then finally, the mapping part to authenticity, coaching, insight, and innovation. As Susan said, that's in the leadership version. You don't have to use that. The workplace version doesn't have that mapping. But what's important about that mapping is that at MHS, we had done a secondary study that showed that those 4 competencies are really critical for a leader at any level. So what we're showing you then within the report is to say, if a leader wants to be more authentic, what scales can they use from the EQI to boost authenticity? Same for coaching, insight, or innovation. So that's why there's the mapping there. I'll stop there with that response, Susan, see if there's anything you wanted to add, and then I'll be ready to bring up a couple more questions for you.
No, Jason, thank you. That did great. I just put up the visual there so people could see it again. And again, the left side it says blind spots. So the lower left quadrant is where the leader rated themselves lower than other raters, so there's less agreement. And then the upper left quadrant is where the leader rated themselves higher than all other readers. So left, think, we're not in agreement. Right side, the allied strengths in the upper right corner, that's where they're strong and they were rated strong. And then the lower right, the reinforced opportunities, is where the the leader rated themselves low. For example, Terry rated himself low in emotional expression, and then, well, actually with Terry it was impulse control. That's a better example. Impulse control, and then other people said, yeah, you got to work on impulse control. So that's where there's agreement among the raters and the leader. I hope that helps. And of course, if anybody wants to send me an email or ping me afterwards, me or Jason, I'm very happy to go into more of an explanation. I'd be delighted.
Great. Perfect explanation there. I think one more thing here we can touch that I think fits here a little bit is there was a question around, what should the total EQ be for a leader? I don't know that we talked a lot about the norms, but there's 2 different norms that show in the report there. So any participant is really being compared to the standard norm base in either one of our versions for the 360 when it comes to the reports. So you are getting a comparison to your scores, and then you're also getting a comparison to a higher level norm for leadership. I'll let Susan answer. I don't see a specific number per se, but that is giving you on the report at least a way for you to know, well, where do I sit in relation to other leaders in other organizations or other industries? So I wouldn't say that it's one specific number you'd want to strive towards. It's just seeing how you would compare to those, but also which one of the competencies are important to you in your organization. But Susan, go ahead and add on to that if you want.
Sure. And again, if anybody wants to get into detail, feel free to email me or message me on LinkedIn. But in general, you're going to look at the standard deviation, which is between 85 and 115, and for the general population. And then you're going to look at, in general, about 50% of people's scores are going to fall between 90 and 110. And that's why I always like to look at the midpoint, just to help the leader have a starting place to take a look at, well, how are you comparing to the general norm population? And you can choose between, internationally, there's some different norm groups you can choose. You can choose North America, you can choose professional and non-professional. And then you've also got the leadership benchmark. And I find that, most leaders just really kind of want to see, how am I doing, kind of compared to other people, and, what does that mean, and it's important, too, when you're presenting this information and coaching leaders around it, again, to emphasize, high doesn't necessarily mean high. It could mean they're beating themselves up a bit, lack of confidence. Or, low doesn't necessarily mean low. It could mean they're beating themselves up a little bit or lacking in confidence, which in and of itself is the place to start with the EQ coaching. Or high doesn't necessarily mean high. That's why the 360 can be really helpful on top of the self-report, because it starts to bridge that gap between self-perception and other perception. See.
Good response there. I think one more that kind of dovetails nicely is this one here about, is it harder for someone to dial back a strength versus balancing it with something they may want to activate more of? So, yeah, kind of what you were talking about, right? High doesn't necessarily always mean a good thing. Maybe we need to dial something back and bring up another scale somewhere else to balancing. Is there anything you've experienced with your debriefs that way that you can add to there, Susan?
Thank you for the question, whoever asked that. Yes, and I think that's where it really goes to people's value system. So if something is in overdrive, so for example, with Terry, he had really high self-regard to the point where it became a strength in overdrive for him, because what that meant to him was to be assertive, to say what's on my mind, is to have integrity and to be confident. And those are all good things, but then we wanted to look at how is that being perceived by others. And we certainly wanted to maintain his level of integrity and feeling assertive and that he could express himself, but doing it in a way that using the other skills, the interpersonal skills, the emotional expression skills that allowed senior leadership, the people he was trying to influence, to allow them to hear him. Very similarly, he worked on that with his 17-year-old son as well, right? So he was very much that I'm going to tell you what's right because this is important and I know, I know best. So it was in all aspects of his life and his relationships, it was really practicing finding mutual goals, aligning around what was important to the person that he was communicating with, whether it was at work or whether it was at home. So he also needed to dial back that tell sell a little bit. And what's really also great about the report that we didn't show you here, it's a really robust report. So again, you can keep it higher level if that's what works better for your leader, but it's a great takeaway for sustainability because there's also a balancing component. So when you talk about balancing a strength with an opportunity, the report tells you right there, and it tells the leader. It might say, well, your assertiveness is way high compared to your empathy. So here's what that could mean. That could mean you're just not really engaging with other people and you're not really listening to other people. And here's some strategies around that. So the report is great for the person who asked that question because it even gives you and the leader that information right there around how to balance.
Great. Thank you for the feedback there. Philip, are we close to time? We've got about a minute left. There were two book questions, Susan. I know we referenced Steve Stein, the EQ leader. There was another one you referenced, Daniel Goldman, Primal, and I'm forgetting the title. Sorry, can you help with that one?
Sure. It's Primal Leadership. It's by Daniel Goldman, Richard Boyatzis, who's one of his longtime partners, and Annie McKee. So Primal Leadership. And that's a great one because it gives a leader, it really talks from a leadership perspective. So it's a great one, I think, for leaders to read as well as coaches and consultants, and positions everything from what they're trying to do and influence as leaders. And it really marries the EQ skills with neurologically what's going on inside our brains and makes that very understandable.
And Susan, actually,
go ahead.
Yeah, if you can actually stay, we can go a little bit over here. And apologize for those of you who have to go, but we had so many great questions. If you want to go a few minutes over, that is fine, and people can always, of course, review the recording.
Yeah, thanks. And I, like Susan said, I encourage you to reach out with us directly. I think what you're seeing there on the screen is a good takeaway where you can reach us at MHS, or you can reach Susan directly if you're interested about certification on the EQI and the EQ 360. Susan or I would be happy to answer any of these direct questions you would have. I mean, with the ones that are left, I'd hesitate to keep answering them as there's a number of different ones, and I'm not sure how many people are interested or they're still on the line. So I think we'd be happy to end here. But thank everyone again for joining us, and thank you, Training Magazine Network, for the availability and the time with your audience. We appreciated speaking with everyone. Thank you, Susan, as well, for your knowledge and sharing that with the group. And I'll leave it to any final remarks from you two.
Great. Thank you. And if anybody does have questions, this is what I'm here for. So, my email, and I'll put it in the chat here, is Susan at the EI coach, saying it as I type here.com. There we go. And one of the best ways to get a hold of me too is on LinkedIn. So it's Susan Clarine on LinkedIn. And if you want to ping me, send me a message, I'm more than delighted to answer your one-on-one questions.
Great, Susan. Well, thank you. We'll definitely have to have you back. We had so much great activity and very, very good feedback from our members on this session. Thank you so much, Susan.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
And I just want to remind everyone that you can use today's Insights widget and actually put your comments in about today's session. And we do review these, so you can put your thoughts, your takeaways, what are you going to use right away. Maybe what you'd like to see next in a webinar about the subjects at hand. So go ahead and log into trainingmagnetwork.com and then click on the link on your screen. and that's also available in the note space, and put in your takeaways. You can also print out a certificate for attending today's event. I want to thank MHS Assessments once again for making today's event possible, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. How to develop leaders that people actually want to work for with Susan Clarine. Thank you once again, Susan, and thank you, Jason, with MHS Assessments for being here today. And again, thank you all to all of our Training Mag Network members.